Now it's rolling, and yes, Sinan, thanks for this great introduction that we could not record, but still, yeah, James,
Okay.
please go.
I had memorized the rest of it, Tolga, so it's going to be difficult for me to repeat it again. But anyways, and I'm just making fun. So we have here James Priest with us to tell us about Sociocracy 3.0. And this is also going to be the third meeting of Teal Agile movement. And since the basics, the fundamentals of Sociocracy 3.0, which is in a quest for the new ways of working that complies with the emerging values of the 21st century. We wanted to have James as our guest here, and he kindly accepted our offer. So I'm leaving the word to James. We're all ears, James.
Okay, thank you very much. So good afternoon, everybody. Firstly, thank you so much for translating, probably for many of you, from English back to your native tongue. I don't speak Turkish, so I'm super grateful that we can communicate anyhow. Yeah, as you were saying there in the introduction, I'm based in Barcelona. I co-developed Sociocracy 3.0 with Bernard Bockelbrink and Liliana. Liliana is also my wife. She's here in the back with my son, and I'm in a boat, if you're wondering what the background is today, in Barcelona. So we have a tiny and moving house today. If you hear any creaking and noises in the background, that's because we have a strong wind and a bit of a storm. So I'm kind of moving around talking to you here. So what I was thinking to do today is to offer you some kind of introduction to Sociocracy 3.0. There's ways to come to, or kind of look at I call it S3 because it's less syllables, right? But there's many ways to look at S3. And with the time that we have, obviously that's quite a limited set of options. So I'm going to give you a kind of helicopter view. It's going to be kind of high level, introduce some concepts, introduce a bit of background and some theory and a couple of examples, and then try to leave plenty of time for some of your questions afterwards, so that we can kind of just orientate according to your curiosity and interest and needs. So what I'm going to do is share the screen. I'll jump straight into the presentation first of all, and then we'll jump back out again for some questions afterwards. So you should be seeing this now, and let's just go on to a screen share here. I'm not sure if I can ditch this as well. I think I can somehow. Wait a second. There. Okay. If you lose me at any point, please shout, because I'm on a sim here, so occasionally it's a little bit unreliable. So let me know if I drop out. Okay, so Sociocracy 3.0. It's basically well, we call it a social technology for growing agile and resilient organizations. And I'm going to begin by just giving you a bit of background about that so that you can understand something of what that is. So you've probably heard the term democracy. And what democracy means, basically, rule by the demos. So it's when people have voting privilege, they have the possibility to influence decisions. And most of us are familiar with like representative democracy, for example, and also this idea of majority decision making, you know, so you kind of go for whether the majority of people's favor is, which quite frankly, I think is a bit of a stupid idea, because while it's important to consider the majority opinion, wisdom usually emerges through the minority first into a system. For example, you know, the crazy idea that the Earth went around the sun rather than the sun going around the Earth, and we killed those people until we invented the telescope and realized that actually that was the case. So there's some problems with our current way of decision making. Sociocracy is very similar to democracy, but what it means is rule by the social group. So if we come to Agile for a minute here, and you think about self-organizing teams and enabling teams to have authority within their domain to make and evolve agreements and deliver products end to end, then sociocracy is kind of leading towards that notion that people close to the work should be the ones to influence, make and evolve agreements relating to that work. there's a long history about sociocracy, longer than most people realize. It goes back to the 1850s with Auguste Comte, who coined the term sociology as well. He anticipated that in the future, societies would be governed in a more scientific way. He thought that the social scientists would play a role in the future, and he also coined this term sociology and developed the social sciences. And he wasn't far wrong, I think, because our societies today are very much influenced by the social scientists, for better and for worse sometimes. Sociocracy had quite a long evolution. Lester Frank Ward was curious about taking it back to the roots of the meaning of the word, and he was asking, what would society look like, and the smaller systems like organizations, if the people who were affected by decisions were able to make and influence those decisions? So in the 70s, Gerard Endenberg developed the Sociocratic circle method, which is still around to this day. It never really took off in a big way, I think partly because it was so prescriptive and limiting in what it offered. But that was where a lot of the influence for what we've developed as Sociocracy 3.0 came from. And then some of you, I'm sure, have come across Holacracy as well. That was developed by Brian Robertson and launched around 2008, and took a look at the Sociocratic circle method and many other approaches, and then developed Holacracy really as a way to redistribute power through an organizational system. He was concerned about centralized power and the problems that came from that, and also the limitations that brought to a system. So he took the idea of sociocracy and distributing authority through a system to enable people closer to where value was created to have more influence, and also to answer the question, how do you maintain coherence across a system when you decentralize power to influence in different ways? So Sociocracy 3.0 was launched by Bernard Bockelbrink and I in 2015. Liliana David joined quite soon afterwards, and basically we were trying to answer trying to solve the problem of the fact that every organizational context is unique, and whilst you take a methodology or a framework off the shelf and apply it into an organizational context, some people are going to enjoy that more than others, and generally speaking, these whole system changes into systems can create as many problems as they're meant to solve. So we said, why don't we strip all of these methods and frameworks back and take a look under the hood and see what are some of the underlying patterns that we find there. So we developed S3. We call it a social technology, which basically like tools that help people in social contexts to achieve their objectives together. And S3 is designed to be versatile and adaptable. So we took individual patterns from the various Agile and Lean influenced methodologies and frameworks and from Sociocracy 3.0 and broke it down into the component parts. So it's designed that you can use patterns individually, but they also fit together well. And S3 in general is designed to support people in taking an iterative and incremental approach. So in Agile, you're really aiming for iterative and incremental development of products, right? And you build in fast feedback loops so that you can learn quickly, you reduce waste, and you really stay focused on creating features and products that meet the user need through a close relationship with the customer. So if you want to understand sociocracy, what it's also doing is bringing that agile approach to governance as well, like how you make and evolve agreements in the organization, developing agreements that constrain the organization in an iterative and incremental way. So it's like safe to fail, try, discover outcomes, and then adjust your agreements as you go. So I'm going to come back to that a bit later in a bit more detail. The other thing about S3 is it's free and open. So everything I'm sharing with you here, if you go to the website at sociocracy30.org and so on, all the resources we create are under a Creative Commons license, and they're open and available to use and share, because we didn't want anything to stand in the way of the free distribution of these social technologies to people around the world who would want it. So a menu of patterns. When I say pattern, I mean a guideline for successfully navigating a specific context. And the patterns are designed so that they can be adapted and evolved to suit your specific situations. And when it comes to the patterns, there's 74 patterns, but they're divided into 10 categories currently. In a way, the categories are a bit arbitrary, but it's just a way to break down 74 patterns. And if you're looking for a way to solve a specific challenge that you have or leverage a particular opportunity, then you can narrow down the kind of patterns that might be helpful for you. For example, patterns for organizing work. There's many of the typical patterns you would find familiar in Scrum, for example, in S3, or meeting practices, or ways to define agreements, and so on. So we won't go into it at all, but you'll find on the website the pattern map. There's an interactive pattern map, actually, so you can jump in there and check out each of the individual patterns. But the idea is a bit like going to the restaurant. You're hungry, you have certain kind of nutritional needs on that day, and you take a look at the menu and decide what's going to be helpful for you. That's kind of the way you want to interact with S3. So underneath the patterns are 7 principles. In fact, there's probably many principles, but we chose to name 7 explicitly. Some of them, like equivalence, for example, came very much from sociocracy itself. So this idea of involving people in making and evolving decisions. But I'll just run through them. We've got consent, which I'll come back to in a while, but it basically invites people in organizations to speak up when they see problems with decisions and activity in the organization, which can be a little bit reverse to what people are familiar with, because in some organizations, if you speak up, then you can get fired. But in an organization wanting to adopt these principles, there's an invitation to harness collective intelligence and invite people to speak up, even seeking out to see, hey, what do you think of this? Do you see any problems? Is there anything we can learn from a wider perspective so that we can continuously improve and reduce the problems we run into and increase our effectiveness as an organization? There's also transparency, which is necessary, of course, if you're going to have equivalence and consent, and accountability, which there's a few different ways to understand accountability, but what we mean by that is when you agree to do something, which of course includes agreeing to be a member of an organization, then you're going to follow through on what you agreed to, and you're going to act in a responsible way if you don't for some reason. And more than just doing what you agreed to, it's also about taking ownership for the course of the organization itself. It amazes me how often I hear people who are kind of complaining about the organization they're part of. And one, I feel deeply sad about that, to think that somebody's spending their short, precious life in an environment that is so kind of dissatisfying for them. But the other side of that is recognizing our responsibility in the free world to choose to participate in the organizations that we participate in. So accountability really says, hey, you decided to be there, so how are you going to follow through on that responsibility? How will you be accountable for that? Other principles that very much stem from Agile and Lean, the idea of empiricism, so testing your assumptions through experimentation and revision, and applying what you learn to continuously improve what you're doing as you integrate that empirical learning. And finally, really, really important point in organizations is to be effective. So that's not efficiency, which is doing as much as you can with as little as possible. I mean, that's definitely a useful thing to consider, but thinking about the bigger picture, like what are the consequences of your actions both now and across time, and how do you act in ways that are going to be beneficial across the scope of things that concern you. So the 7 principles are like the thread that weaves the patterns together. And the thing about any pattern or like practice processes, you're going to come to a moment when it's inadequate to meet your needs. And when that happens, you really need to be able to revert back to some kind of higher order of reference. And the principles, which really guidelines for behavior, they give you that higher order of reference. so that you can adapt patterns if necessary, and also innovate and create new ways of responding when current practices are inadequate to meet your needs. So, one way to think about areas that S3 can support in an organization is to think about some different dimensions of an organization. We're not going to get into these, and it's not an S3 pattern, but it does help to understand a little bit where S3 can bring value. So one area is around making and evolving agreements. So, some organizations are really effective with decision making and some struggle. So how do you tap collective intelligence to evolve effective decisions in your organization? Another area is doing stuff. So, and not just doing any old thing. Some organizations are very good at doing things, but are they doing the right things? So how do you maximally create value with your efforts? Being responsive. So we hear a lot these days about business agility and the different dimensions that refers to. There's been an enormous investment into agile operations and agile product development, but how agile is the organization as a whole? How rapidly can it respond to changes when necessary, like a global pandemic, for example? And last but not least, participation. So how do you grow and maintain a startup spirit in an organization as it scales, right? How do you maintain that level of engagement and willingness to be accountable for responsibilities throughout the organization? So if we have more time, I would actually invite you to spend some time to reflect on these dimensions, but you might want to do that afterwards and just ask yourself, where are we strong in an organizational context we're part of, and where are we challenged somehow? Because especially answering that question where you're challenged can help to focus attention where specific needs might be and help to then identify patterns from S3 or any other pattern actually that might be helpful for you. Okay, so it's a good question. Why Sociocracy 3.0? The problem we tried to solve was that every context is unique, and there's no one-size-fits-all solutions to navigate complexity. So we do have a tendency as human beings to look outside of ourselves for answers and solutions to our problems, and that's quite natural and makes sense. But we can also overdo that and become dependent on external things that at some point or other let us down. And the other problem we were trying to address was the fact that to deal with complexity, people really need to get together and figure things out. It's like you or me, I'm sorry, let me go back. You or me alone are not smart enough to navigate complexity effectively. And so if you look at what we've achieved as a species, it's absolutely extraordinary. But it's really dependent on many contributors to be able to manifest the successes that we've achieved. And one of the other things is that when it comes to challenging situations especially, then our habitual behaviors tend to override any kind of common sense, and unless we're in chaos, we tend to fall back on our habits to try and solve problems. And our habits are great when they solve the problem, but when we're under stress and we fall back on our habits and they start to create the problems we're trying to avoid, then we really need some kind of alternative point of reference and the intention to pause and reflect before we get into reaction. So S3 patterns, it's not just that they're useful in their own right in certain contexts, but they also give you some kind of contrasting perspective to become more conscious of your habits, right? So a way to think about that is that at the interface between your habits and what's new, there's potential for greater consciousness. Yeah, so it's not about doing things the way an S3 pattern suggests, but about reflecting on how does that pattern invite me to respond in this situation, and how would I habitually respond, and do I want to continue with how I habitually do it, or is there some adjustment that I would like to make? So S3 really facilitates consciousness and learning by waking us up to our habits. Okay, so I'm going to just run through a few concepts and give you a bit of background from S3. So one concept that's quite unique to S3, I think, is the concept of driver. And driver is the way we describe a person or a group's motive for responding to a situation. So, for example, I was invited to come and talk here tonight. I was told that there was maybe some interest, and what I had to share would be relevant in the context of the other presentations that have been happening. And there was a need to introduce some of you to S3 and to give a bit of background so that you could make a more informed choice about whether it's useful. That's a way to summarize a driver, and it motivated me to spend the time to join you tonight. Another concept in S3 is domain. And domain is, well, one way to think about it is just an area of work or an area of responsibility in an organization. We refer to it as a distinct area of activity, influence, and decision-making in an organization. So I'm introducing these concepts with you to explain something about S3. If you think about any organizational context, then there's a process of delegating influence through the system as the organization grows. So an organization begins with an individual or a small group of people. There's a driver, which you can see depicted in the middle here with that symbol. And around the driver is a distinct area of influence, activity, and decision-making. And so as an organization begins to develop, we start to see sub-drivers. You know, when you decide to respond to a situation, you suddenly become aware that there's like 10 other things that are needed in order to respond to the situation, and so on. So you kind of get this hierarchy of drivers. And so in a situation with an organization here, you can see that these folks have now come across a sub-driver that needs responding to, and sometimes they'll respond to that for themselves. But as an organization grows often, it's helpful to clarify that area of work and then delegate it to other people who take responsibility for it. And this is really how organizational hierarchies grow, right? You've got a small group of people, they take an area of responsibility they have, and they contract with people to take responsibility for it. So accountability still lies overall with the delegator, but in this illustration here, you see the delegatees have taken responsibility for this area of work. And ideally, the delegators clarify the area of work, and they delegate influence, recognizing the fact they're still overall accountable for the work. And also, ideally, the delegator would provide support and opportunities to support the delegatees to develop. So there's a contractual arrangement between delegator and delegatee to be able to deliver this area of value within this wider domain that the delegators are responsible for. Now, that's kind of obvious in a way, it happens often, but what doesn't happen so often is explicitly clarifying the domain and making the contract explicit and putting in place the support needed for delegatees to be able to handle that domain and respond to the driver for that domain in a suitable way. So what S3 offers is the delegate influence pattern, describe organizational drivers, clarify domains, and so on and so forth, to be able to make those relationships more explicit. When it comes to clarifying domains, there's a pattern clarify domains, which offers a template for important things to consider when it comes to clarifying a domain. It's not mandatory, of course, to do anything from S3 or to follow this template, but it gives you some ideas about things to consider that might be important to clarify when you're taking responsibility for something from someone or when you're delegating responsibility to others. So I'm going to move on a little bit here because I just want to keep it high level, but there's also patterns in S3 for building organizations. So the pattern of role, different team patterns. Roles and teams are two basic ways that people in organizations account for domains. When I say domain, by the way, I mean like HR, Agile coaching, product development, R&D, you know, just areas of work that you're familiar with somehow. Another pattern that's we see emerging in holacracy and also the Sociocratic circle method is this idea of linking. And it's basically where people in one team see a need for influence in another team or transmitting information and influence. And so linking and double linking between domains enables people to flow information and influence across the system. and also representative, which is the name we give in S3 for somebody who's selected to represent a team in another domain. And when you piece all that together, there's various ways, if you look at organizations in the world today, that people piece together domains and link between them in order to be able to flow information and influence effectively through a system to really support the creation of value in the system. And I won't get into these structural patterns today, but I did want to just reinforce this idea. When you're thinking about organizational structure, ask yourself, how do you enable information to flow through the path of least resistance? And how do you distribute influence throughout a system to maximally enable people to be able to create value? That, I think, is a very helpful way to consider evolving an organizational system. So let's imagine for a minute, to complete this picture, you've clarified domains for an organization. There's been contractual agreements for a distribution of work and responsibility through the system. Now you've got everybody working in their various areas in the organization. And so how do you maintain coherence through the system and respond quickly and effectively to changing contexts? So this is where a pattern called navigate via attention comes in. And basically, navigate via attention is about paying attention to your inner state. Because when you perceive a situation that's different to what you expect or wish to see, then you experience some kind of tension. And so if we can pay attention to that tension when we experience it, we can go behind it and we can consider, what is it that's actually stimulating that tension? And pause before responding to just really check what's going on. What is it that caught our attention? What is it that seems different to what we expect or wish to see? So navigating via tension invites us to look behind the tension, understand why we experience that, to check the relevance of it. Does it matter in the context of our organization? Who's responsible for dealing with that kind of thing, if it matters? And passing on that information to whoever's concerned so that they can respond, and then evaluate and evolve on the basis of the consequences of that response. So this brings us back to driver and why it's useful to understand drivers. Okay, so if a driver is a motive for responding to a situation, it helps to understand what is it that's actually happening, and what is it that's needed. And we can break that down even further by objectively describing the current situation that's stimulating that tension, and also, why does that matter? Like, what's the effect of that situation on the organization? Or what's the anticipated effect of that? And on the other side, what is it that's needed? What's deficit somehow, that where we respond to it would bring about some kind of future situation that we'd prefer to see? So what would be the impact of responding to that? And I want to give you an example of a driver summary here, because it helps to understand, a bit like user stories in software development. It gives you a very concise bundle of data that you can flow through the organization to the people it concerns so that they can understand, determine relevance and importance, and respond if necessary. So in this case, the example was information is unstructured, it's kept in silos and sometimes unrecorded, and this leads to an inability to understand and contribute to the whole picture. So we need relevant information to be shared proactively to provide the necessary customer solutions. So this was a real example from a customer of ours, and they were really struggling with this issue. And by taking the time to describe the driver clearly, it helped them to learn about the situation, to make sure that they were on the same page before they then jumped into asking what to do about it. So I'm going to just jump forward a little bit from here for a moment, because I'd like to cover a couple more points before we go to questions. One question people often ask is a driver relevant? And that's a good question, because all you do in your life is identify and respond to drivers. And what I mean by that is, if everything seems okay, then our preferred state as human beings is unconsciousness. You know, if we could go through our day without having to pay attention to much at all, then that's an ideal state. But when we see something that looks like it might be a problem for us, or we see an opportunity that looks like something that's going to be useful for us, then we want to pay attention to it. So qualifying drivers is simply about checking if it would help the organization to respond, or if it would harm the organization if we don't respond. And that's a bit different to making the decision about whether a driver is important or not. That comes later with prioritization, but in this case, we're saying, is it relevant? So if we go back to the metaphor of people in the organization acting like nerve endings in a living system, we're inviting everybody to pay attention and bring into the consciousness of the organization information when they see a situation that could bring harm to the organization or could be of value to the organization. And then you prioritize it later in your backlogs and respond accordingly. Okay, so let me see how I can wrap this up. Yeah, so this question, who's responsible, is also important to answer. You know, I often ask people in organizations, how clear are you on your area of responsibility? And it usually averages around 50 to 60%. It's a bit different depending on the national culture that I'm in. And then I ask people how much understanding do you have of what other people are responsible for? And it's usually less. And in all cases, regardless of culture, people generally say it would be useful to have more understanding of the areas of responsibility that people have. And I think that's particularly relevant in this case. We were talking about domains earlier, but if you don't know what the domains of responsibility are that you have, and if you know what domains of responsibility other people have, then it's very difficult to navigate via attention, because you need to be able to inform people of drivers when you become aware of them and they don't fall into your area of responsibility. Now, I just want to clarify on that. We're not talking about, it's not my job, it's not my problem, so I'll leave it. If you can take care of it yourself and it doesn't cause any harm or unintended consequences, then do. But when it's something that you can't deal with, then you need to be able to pass it on to the people who are responsible for that. So that might be people in your own team, it might also be people in specific roles, and it might be people in other teams besides. So I'm going to just move on a little bit from here, because what I'd like to just cover before I wrap up would be to introduce, I'm sorry, let me just go back here one. To introduce a couple more concepts from S3. The concept of governance, which I mentioned at the start. So governance in an organization is setting objectives and making and evolving agreements that guide people towards achieving them. So that's often done in a centralized way by management, for example. And S3 provides patterns to support governance being distributed throughout the wider organization. So they're freeing people up to decide and act for themselves as much as possible within the clearly defined constraints of the domain. And secondarily, operations, which is an area we're much more familiar with, often especially in agile environments. So doing the daily work and organizing activities within those constraints defined through governance. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to come out of the share here for a minute, because I just want to wrap this up and leave time for your questions. One observation that we've had with organizations, especially agile organizations, is there's an enormous amount of investment into agile operations. Billions, you know, it's an enormous industry, and some of you probably work in that industry yourselves. But the kind of Achilles heel and blind spot in many organizations today is the idea of agile governance. Like, if you're going to free people up into organizing teams and you're going to enable greater autonomy within teams, then you still need to handle organizational management in some way. And if you reduce the management hierarchy, then you need to find ways to distribute the responsibilities of organizational management through this. Historically, over the last years, Frederick Laloux's book, you know, the emergence of the teal meme and this idea of removing management and everybody take responsibility for organization. It's only as successful as the ability of the people collectively to govern the organization as well as to do the daily work. And so S3, besides offering various patterns for organizing work, has a particular emphasis on that domain of governance to enable people to be able to harness the collective intelligence of a system, and to be able to take ownership of organizational management in new ways. Because if you don't, then at the end, you end up justifying the case for a more centralized management hierarchy again, and often things revert back to a system that was worse than it was before. So I'm going to hit pause there, and I'd like to bring it back to you and ask you to follow your curiosity.
Thank you very much for the excellent presentation, James. I took lots of notes on my notepad, and also at the same time, I couldn't agree more. I mean, self-organization does not necessarily mean eliminating the management from the first moment. I mean, because it would lead to chaos, but maybe eliminating it gradually in a self-organized manner based on the maturity of the organization, right? And also we have here with me Barış, Mehmet, and Burak, who are also, I mean, my colleagues that we are working together for Untitled Agile movement. But there are also many other questions that have already been raised too. So I want to share the screen so that you can also see them on Slido. So the top rated question, as we see on the screen, is: in the last half decade or so, world of models, canvases, frameworks to humanize work life, what makes S3.0 different? Are there any great implementations? So we would like to hear your thoughts.
Great. Could you leave the question, maybe leave the questions up just for a minute, because maybe I can nail a couple of those as I go. It's a great question. I think the thing that makes S3 different is it's not something that you do. You know, you don't implement S3. It doesn't make any sense. There's 74 patterns currently. There's likely to be more in the future. And it really is a menu that you pull from according to need. You know, the patterns in S3 were there long before S3 was. We didn't kind of create the patterns. What we did is we observed people in organizations and looked at behavior patterns that had emerged over time and prevailed in certain contexts because of their usefulness. I'll give an example. It's like checking whether there's a reason not to do something before you go ahead and doing it, right? That's what we teach our kids. But on a daily basis, we can act even when there's a reason not to, you know, and disregard the fact that there's some argument for why we should do things differently. So you can't really fit S3 in any particular kind of box, because you can take those patterns individually or piece them together, and you can adapt them to your specific needs. They've got relevance in typical organizational hierarchies. They've got relevance in corporations, in non-profit contexts, in families with kids, in banks, in academia, and so on and so forth. But you want to identify your areas of need, prioritize them, start at the top, and when you see that there's a specific situation that your current behavior doesn't adequately address, then you can look to S3 to see if there are options that might help. Yeah. It's also complements very much any other framework or methodology that you are using. So if you run into limitations with that approach, you can look to S3 to see if there's ways to change it. And if something doesn't work for you, then throw it out, adapt it, change it, and try something else. In the end, it's about learning to think for yourself, about paying attention to what's happening and what's needed, and about taking an iterative and incremental approach, running experiments to see what works and what doesn't, and paying attention to what you learn so you can continue to adapt and improve. And the other question was, any examples of large organizations? Well, so S3 patterns are being used in organizations of just about any size, but it's not that S3 has been implemented in those organizations. It's just that one, some, or many are being used. So, for example, Ericsson is a company that's using, Volvo in many of its different organizations is using patterns from S3. There's telecommunication companies in Sweden, for example, in Belgium, that are using S3 patterns. And there's many startups as well, tech organizations, academic institutions and schools and so on and so forth. But it's not that you can say, well, this is an organization that's doing S3, because if they were to claim that, then in a way they've misunderstood what S3 is about. What they're really doing is they're using patterns from S3 and synergizing them with many other patterns that they know and use to create their own bespoke way of dealing with things on a day-by-day basis. And that would be an appropriate way to look.
I see. So what you're saying, as I understood, is that, I mean, these concepts are not necessarily interconnected, and I mean, it does not come with a package, right? So, I mean, you can just pick and maybe implement just one or two things that you think like that fits your organization or your needs, and you can just go ahead with that by also eliminating the rest of it.
Yeah, that's completely true, but it's also not totally true, because the patterns do fit together as well. There's a synergy between them. They complement each other. So you could very well pull in many patterns and use them together. And in fact, one of the criticisms of this pattern-based pull approach, that we use to design S3 has been, man, there's 74 patterns. It's like, I don't know where to start. It's like maybe start at all, because there's no guidance. And as human beings, we really benefit from some kind of starting point as well. So if you don't understand the patterns, then it's quite difficult to know where to start and what to choose. And so we are actually in the process now of putting together a framework, which kind of, it's not so much like a set of patterns, but it's more a set of practices that people can refer to and consider the current status in the organization, see, a bit like with the 4 dimensions, to see where are we strong, where are we challenged, and behind that then offer in certain patterns that would be more or less useful in that case. So it is important that people have a starting point, but we didn't want to collude with that tendency people have to look outside of them for the answer and get caught up in the idea that S3 was the next promised magic formula that was going to make everything better. It's people that make things better, not methods and frameworks. Yeah, and we do well to realize that before we get into bed with any particular way of doing things, I would say.
Yeah, maybe, I mean, implicitly, we're all looking forward to that magic stick that's going to change the world and make it a better place, right?
Yeah, sure.
That's why we have high expectations of this new sort of methodology. Yeah. And maybe I
can say it is COVID-19.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe we can take a look at Slido again for the other questions. Yeah, so do you think that S3 is also applicable at organizations that operate in countries where democracy is not well established or does not even exist at all? What do you think about it?
Well, once again, come back to the origins of S3, right? So it's a menu of human behavior patterns that have been emerging and evolving in human collaboration over a long time, like a really long time. And so really, if we frame that question like that, are there patterns in S3 that are useful for human beings in any context, including environments that are very undemocratic, maybe environments where there's heavy oppression, disadvantage, and so on? Then yes, absolutely. So S3's got relevance for one, if it's like you wake up in the morning and you just think, what are my priorities today, right? Then you're pulling in prioritized backlog from S3. So we're using many of these patterns on a daily basis, and people are using these patterns in all kinds of contexts in the world, not just the privileged first world democratic societies in which we live. But if you ask the question, are there certain organizational contexts where S3 patterns would not be welcomed, right? Or where S3 patterns are likely to be constrained by people with authority who might be threatened in some way by creating a more kind of sociocratic environment, right? Where people have more influence? Absolutely, of course. And you really need buy-in from the top within an organizational system for S3 patterns to take hold and really deliver value throughout that whole organizational system. Otherwise, you're going to bump into a glass ceiling or maybe a very explicit ceiling somewhere where those experiments are shut down. But I do want to add to that most people mean well, most people, it's like some people have their agendas and they're in things for their own gain. But in an organizational system, when people either one, see problems that they can't solve, and they're at a moment in their life where they're prepared to recognize that, or secondly, they see value in doing things differently, then often they're going to be open to consider alternatives. And so one way to approach a system where you don't have buy-in from the top, for example, is to think about what are the objectives of the organization and how does integrating some of these patterns support the organization to achieve its objectives? Because that's the story you want to tell. You want to explain how it helps, because in the future, then people's attention and when they see that it has utility. Yeah. So people aren't afraid of change when they see it has value for them in achieving whatever objectives they have. Yeah. But if you talk about change without talking about why that would be relevant to do first, then of course people resist, because we've all got enough to deal with in life already without having to think about something new that we don't understand.
Yeah, yeah. And linking to this, I really liked your quote on one of those slides: habitual behaviors and strategies eat common sense for breakfast.
Yeah.
I noted it down, and it resembles Peter Drucker's famous saying, culture eats strategy for breakfast. I couldn't agree.
Exactly, yeah. I half stole the quote there. Yeah.
And other questions, a question maybe also in our minds, but you partially already answered that. What are the differences between Agile as we know and S3?
Well, so Agile as an approach, right, is about remembering who your customer is, having a close relationship with them, and taking an iterative and incremental approach to how you create value and deliver it to them, right? I mean, that's one way of kind of summarizing it. Lean also had a pretty big influence in our thinking around S3. You know, so how do you avoid building inventory? You deliver on an as-needed basis and you minimize waste, right? So to get the best outcomes from our efforts in this short, precious lifetime, it's something like that, right? So you can't really say that S3 differs from that because it had such a big influence in how we put it together. But I think what's happened in Agile, and it's not my background, right? I didn't come from an Agile background. I'm not a technical guy. You know, I came more from people and relationships and building community and dealing with conflict, this kind of thing. But Agile has kind of got a little bit co-opted into these like different sects around different methodologies. But if you get back to the basics as what it's inviting us, it really is saying, just pay attention to what's needed, you know, and harness collective intelligence and let people get on with stuff, bring appropriate people together so you've got a diversity of skills to be able to deliver value where it's needed. And S3 is supporting us to build networks of micro-organizations, you know, individuals and teams of people who are working together towards common objectives, keeping their finger on the button or finger on the pulse, you know, and asking in each case, how can we deliver value where it's needed, and how can we learn fast in a iterative way so that we don't go off the rails without realizing it. You know, we can continuously pivot and adapt as required so that we can really get the best out of how we spend our lives together. And you know, and organizations are about human needs, right? That we evolved to cooperate because it helped us to meet our needs as a species better than doing it on our own. Agile is all about meeting human needs, the customer needs, and looking at how to do that better together than leaving the customer to do it alone. So I'm not sure there's so much difference in essence. I think the only thing that S3 brings is this added dimension of sociocracy, you know, this idea of rule by the social group, and bringing tools for scaling agility throughout the whole organization that until now have been lacking in most of the Agile methodologies and frameworks that have been on offer.
Cool. So, I mean, you go so deep to the roots of why Agile was founded. And I mean, in the end, the foundation, the pillars are quite overlapping when we talk about sociocracy and Agile.
Sure.
And maybe one last final question. And yeah, so what are the weak areas in sociocracy? I mean, what would you say like the areas for improvement, or like the points that needs to be filled more What do you think these, let's say, areas of weakness are?
Every rose has its thorn. Maybe.
So,
Every rose has its thorn. That's kind of maybe
Yeah.
it's a Turkish saying,
yeah,
but it's also in English.
yeah, sure. Every rose has its thorn. Well, like I said already, I think one of the problems was our attempts to not pigeonhole people into a certain approach left people a bit overwhelmed by all the patterns. That's one thing. Secondly, has been our capacity to create learning resources for people. You know, so we've put it out free, it's Creative Commons license, but if you want to learn about S3, there's actually a lot under the hood, you know? It's like, it's really, really vast when you start getting into it. There's various processes and practices, and more importantly, there's a whole evolution of mindset required to even understand some of the patterns thoroughly, let alone to be able to use them. And you really learn about S3 through doing. So I think the big challenge we have right now is how to communicate S3 in different ways to people. So when they come to it in the area of interest and need that they have, there's ways that they can understand it, that they can learn about it, that they can find support in how they go out and use it, and get feedback in that, you know, so that they can learn with others together. So right now we're aiming to solve that. One with the framework that I spoke about, which we're releasing soon. That will be coming up on the S3 website. And the other thing we're doing is creating an online learning community. And we're building a lot of self-directed learning modules. Thank you, coronavirus, because it gives us time to get on with these things, which is great. You know, I'm loving for that, and really to enable people so much more to be able to dive into S3 for themselves, not have the bottleneck having to come to a presentation like this and getting blasted with like 5,000 bits of information, most of which you forget in 10 minutes, you know, but to really take it step by step and focus on learning that's specific to your needs. I think if we can get that nailed down more clearly over the next year or so, then it's going to make it S3 accessible to more people. And I really hope that we can achieve that.
Excellent. So, and as the moderator, I mean, I want to use my bonus right for a final question that Burak has raised. And who triggers a sociocracy movement in an organization? Is it a bottom-up or top-down movement in the very early stage of transformation?
Both and. Yeah, both and. I'm thinking of a senior manager in KBC Bank in Belgium, went back into his department, turned the whole thing on its head. 125 people. He said, we're going to have a bottomarchy instead of a hierarchy from now on. Teams are going to select representatives. We'll create a delegate circle, which is a way of managing a bigger domain, you know, and teams will select people to make and evolve management decisions for the whole department from now on. And then that rippled out through the whole of KBC Bank, right? On the other end of that, there was a case in a small education organization, like 12 people, I think, where some of the staff there wanted to use S3. The manager, like the director, was really against it. So they kind of did it in secret. It benefited not only them, but many of their customers. And then one day at a conference, a customer came to the director of the company and said, wow, it's just so amazing what you're doing, you know, these things with S3, and it's been so valuable for us. You're such an inspiration. And this guy was like, what? You know, he had no idea. And then he became very pro S3. So by whatever means, you know, the only thing I would say is, I think this is true for any of us, if you want to bring change in an organizational system and you're kind of banging your head against a closed door most of the time in the hope that one day something small will change, and you enjoying that kind of thing, thanks a lot, you know, because somebody needs to do it. But at the same time, there's so many opportunities now to get together with like-minded people, create startups, to do things in a new way. And if it makes your heart sing to be with like-minded people who really want to do that from the start, then get out there and create vicious little that eat the legs of these big old dinosaurs out. And that's cool too. You know, so pick your battles wisely, think carefully about how you want to spend your short, precious lifetime, but be aware that we do need people who are prepared to go up against these big systems and bring influence there. And it's not lost, you know, because it inspires others and it brings hope to others. But if that's not floating your boat, then get out there and start something new, because there's plenty of opportunity for that as well.
we couldn't be more thankful, James, and thanks for spending 1 hour of your short, let's say, precious lifetime. And also, I believe, I mean, you have already underestimated your presentation. I mean, we will be remembering most of the topic that you have shared with us, and it was an inspiring presentation. And also thank you for being so open and generous about your thoughts and accumulated knowledge with us. And now it's our duty to maybe visit Sociocracy website and get deeper about S3. And we would be more than happy to be in touch with you and to raise you questions maybe in the future, or maybe to welcome you to some future events that would also be held in Istanbul. And thank you very much for flying over to Istanbul, and we wish you a nice flight back home.
It's a pleasure, man. Thanks for having me. You guys are doing a great thing, I think. It's really, really inspiring. So thanks a lot. Yeah.
Thank you, James. So have a good evening.
And thank you all for attending this Agile Space event, and hope to see you tomorrow in another Agile Space event. Have a nice dinner maybe. This is the hardest part. Nobody wants to go, so just
exactly.
I think Burak will close. Anyways, I'm stopping the recording, so
okay then. So see you tomorrow then. Herkese